No.
Welcome back to Forza Horizon 4, and today I thought I'd bring you a tuning tutorial video for the ACS launch. Now I'm sure most of you know what that is at this point, but if you don't and you're new to the channel, the ACS launch is a special launching method where you just toggle with the button layout in Forza and you can make the car launch really quickly without any wheel spin. If you don't know what the launch is, make sure you watch the my tutorial video on how to do this launch before trying to tune a car for it. So I will link that as the pinned comment in the comment section. It will be in the description, and I'll probably put a card in the top right hand corner of the screen now if you don't know what that launch is. But if you do know what the ACS launch is, I'm going to get into how to tune for it now. I'm going to split this video into 3 parts like I did my other tuning tutorial ones. So it's going to start off with the parts and upgrades you want to equip to the car, then the base setup, and finally fine tuning. This launching method is pretty easy and tuning for it is really easy as well. The base setup tends to work on most tunes nearly perfectly anyway, so it is definitely the easiest Forza to get quickest times with as long as you're doing this method. So let's start off with the upgrades you want to equip. First of all, always go over to conversions, then engine swaps, and you always want to equip the engine with the most horsepower, except some instances, rare instances, like the Mosler for instance, where you want to equip the engine with slightly less power, because sometimes the really high powered engines like the 6.5 litre V12 are so much heavier than the other one, they actually cancels out with their extra power. But for this one you do want to go for the racing V12. If you have the option of the 6.5 litre V12 or the I think it's a 7.2 litre V8, go for the 7.2 litre V8, it's usually quicker. But for this instance we're going to go with the racing V12. Then you always want to be all-wheel drive. This is a Lamborghini, so it does come all-wheel drive anyway. Then for this you always want to go for twin turbos. This car doesn't have any other options, but always go for the twin turbos. Never go for superchargers, unless the only car I've found where you want to go for the supercharger is the Mustang RTRS 5, and that is just because the supercharger has instant torque and that car has massive tyres, so it does tend to bog down a bit if you don't have the supercharger. But always go for the twin turbo in most instances, so you won't really need to bother with the supercharger. So equip the twin turbo. Then you just want to upgrade all of the engine parts except for, I'll get to it in a minute, I believe it's the intercooler. Not the intercooler, oil cooler. Yeah, intercooler's fine, put that on. Now, you don't want to equip the oil cooling in some instances. We'll check now. What you need to look for is the difference in power and weight that it adds. This is going to be adding 6 horsepower, but it's going to be adding 7 kilograms of weight, which you don't want. You always want a positive horsepower per kilogram, so don't add that if you're adding more weight than power. But it is pretty close here, so it probably wouldn't make much difference, but I'm not going to add it, because as I said, it's giving you more weight than it is power. Then move on to platform and handling. You want to put the lightest, best brakes. Suspension for drag racing, always go for rally springs because you can make them softer, and the damping softer, which is a lot better for tuning for drag racing. And then race, front and rear anti-roll bars. Don't equip a roll cage, it's just unnecessary weight you don't need, because you're not going around any corners. You don't really need the gains from the roll cage. Then always most weight reduction you can. Coming on to the clutch, lightest clutch, race gearbox, lightest driveline, and differential, always race diff, so you can adjust. It doesn't really matter that much, the diff, except for adjusting your front and rear bias for the power. That's the only real thing. Adjusting the acceleration, deceleration doesn't make too much difference for drag racing. Then tyres, always want to go with drag tyre compound. Front tyres, don't equip front tyre width. This is where a lot of people would equip it, but I found from tuning on this game for quite a while now that you don't want front tyre width. You benefit more from the weight you save rather than the grip you save, especially seeing as most of the power is going to be sent to the rear wheels anyway. You're only really using the front wheels for the launch, that's why it will drive. Then rear tyres, you want to max them out. Wheels, you want to go for the lightest wheels you can find. In this instance, I'm just going to go with the usual one people use for drag racing. So you've got these world racing wheels. They don't look too great on this car actually, so I'll just show you some other ones you can use. There are quite a few on this first set of wheels you can use. Go with, not them. We'll just go with them. As long as you've got the wheels that are the lightest you can get, it doesn't really matter what they look like. Then don't add any rim size upgrades, it's just additional weight you don't need. Then moving on to aero, don't equip any aero. Front and rear aero is just going to add more drag, and the car will be slower in a straight line, which is obviously not what you want for drag racing. So that's the upgrades part complete, and I'll rejoin you for the base setup. Moving on to the base setup you want to equip to the car. This will work on most cars with this launch, and it will work quite well. Some of you may have noticed if you watched some of my tune videos before that this base setup is actually what I kept on the car because it worked really well anyway, besides from the gearing, because the gearing, you can't have a universal gear setup for every car because it does depend on a load of factors like the amount of grip, the weight, the engine you use, the amount of power, so you can't base set up the gearing. So if you want to know how to tune the gearing, make sure you watch the fine tuning bit, which I'm going to show you guys after this. I'm not really going to explain any of this base setup. I'll leave the explaining of why I've done some of this stuff to the fine tuning part. So I'm just going to flick through now so you can see what upgrades I've equipped. So tires, you just want to put them to the lowest setting. Gearing, as I said before, you can't put a universal setup on, so ignore that gearing, just leave your gearing stock for now. Alignment, you want to go 0 for all the camber and toe, and then max front caster angle. Anti-roll bars, go softest setting. Springs, all the way soft. Ride height, maximum at the front, lowest at the rear. Damping, I've gone maximum front rebound, lowest rear rebound, and then mirrored that on the bump stiffness. Aero, you shouldn't have any aero at this point because you shouldn't have equipped a wing. If you have equipped a wing, make sure you go and remove it because it's just going to slow you down, even if you set it to 0 in the aero settings. If you're tuning a car that comes with aero normally and you can't remove it, set the aero all the way to the left to 0. That's the best you can do in that situation, seeing as you can't remove the wing. Brakes don't really matter, but here's the setup I tend to use. Then differential, I've gone 100, 0, 100, 0, and 80%. You can go anywhere between 78 and 80 really is the starting setup. My Leaderboard, my McLaren tune even uses 90% diff, so it can vary quite a lot depending on the car, but a good starting point is around 78 to 80%. So that's the base setup, and now move on to fine tuning. Moving on to the fine tuning part of this tutorial, this is where we're going to adjust all the settings we set in the base tune setup to try and get the car as quick as possible. Obviously I'm not going to do it very well in this video because I am trying to make this video not 5 hours long, so I'm just going to roughly go over what you do. Quickly before we get into it, I did say this at the start, but I'm going to repeat it again. Make sure you know how to do this ACS launching method before trying to go any further. None of these tunes using this tuning setup method of tuning are going to work in the slightest unless you do the right launching method. So if you don't know how to do that, make sure you check out my video in the comments section. It will be the pinned comment. Now moving on to tuning the car, you always want to start with gearing, seeing as there's no base gear setup that works, so you want to try and get the gearing roughly right before you start messing with any of the other settings. What you're going to want to do for this launch is try and set it up. We're going to start with first gear. Set it up so first gear is as short as possible without the car's wheels spinning. So you do want a tiny bit of wheel spin to optimize this launching method, but only at the top end of the gear. So the way if you really don't have a clue about tuning, I'll just roughly explain it now. Moving it to the right, the first gear and all the other gears as well, shortens the gear. So pretty much the gear reaches a lower speed the more you move it to the right. The more you move it to the left, the longer the gear gets. Final drive doesn't really matter, to be honest. I'm just going to set that at 4. So we're going to check what the car is like currently with the base gear setup. I'm going to show you what it does and then tell you how to go from there. Right, as you can see there, the first gear is way too long. The car accelerated really slowly. It didn't spin at all. It's got way too much grip for a gear that long. So what you're going to want to come and do is go to gearing, move it to, just keep moving it to the right until you get to a point, as I said, where it's as much to the right as possible but doesn't spin. So we'll try about 3.7. I believe with this racing V12 you can shorten the gear quite a lot. It doesn't have that much torque. Yeah, see it bogged down again there. If you get to a point where you're all the way to the right of the first gear, so you're at the maximum setting, which I believe is 6, just move your final drive to the right and then it will counter that out. So you can keep moving the first gear to the right. Right, now let's see if that's made any difference. I only moved it a tiny bit. Still nowhere near. Let's try it way further. I'll try 5. This is pretty much the key part. Getting this first gear right is where everything stems off of. Even at 5, the car is bogging down. As I said, this V12 doesn't have much torque, I think, so you don't really spin the wheels. What I'm going to do is I'm going to move the final drive up because I am getting, as you probably noticed there, really close to the end of the first gear bar, and you don't want that because you might be missing out on some extra time if it doesn't let you move it any further. We'll go back to 4.9 there because we did move the final drive quite a lot. Right, still not right. What I'll do now is I'll just keep messing around with it, not recording and telling you what I'm doing, and I'll just keep the video playing in the background but sped up so you can see what I'm doing. So I ended up sticking with 5.5 on the first gear and 5 on the final drive. This car is a bit heavy for this engine, so it wasn't really spinning at all, and you can end up making the first gear too short. So if you're tuning in a car with a lot of grip like this and you get to a point where the first gear is lasting about 2 meters on the road, then you've gone too far. You're better off going more to the left and having a longer first gear. It's fine. It's quite a balancing act trying to find the perfect point between the first and second gear. Now moving on to the second gear, with this launching method, if you've watched the tutorial, you know you need to shift into second gear without the clutch, and pretty soon because your first gear is so short. And you're going to want to move this to, it's pretty difficult to explain because I'm just so used to doing it. You want to adjust this so when you change into second gear, you're in the power band. I didn't check stupidly before starting this the power band for this engine, but you just have to go into the telemetry settings and see at what RPM peak power and peak torque are, and then try and adjust your gears so they are in the power band and in the torque band for the most amount of time possible. I'm going to go for 3.1 here and demonstrate and tell you from what happens what's wrong with the gears, unless I've nailed it first time. Okay then, I believe first gear may be too short. Yep, second gear is way too short now. You could see there, the second I changed into second gear, it was already at the top of second gear. You want second gear to be a lot longer than first is. It may look a bit unnatural in the gears there, but that's what you want. For those who don't know, it is pretty obvious to me, but in the bottom right hand corner you can see a graph of the top speed that each gear is going to reach based on the x-axis. You can see where the top of the line for each gear meets the line at the top. That's where the top speed is for that gear. I'm going to try 2.19. Believe for this engine you want about 4 gears for the whole quarter mile. That was pretty good there. You saw that as I changed into second gear, it was in the power band and it was lasted long enough that it wasn't just instant, so it was still useful. I'll demonstrate again. Now what you want to do, the other gears are fairly, you're going to want to use 4 gears pretty much for every drag car in the quarter mile. You're going to want to use 4 gears. The way you figure that out is you just want to see if you set each gear so that when you change gear it's in the power band. just do that for all gears and see how many you need to reach the end of the drag strip, then you'll figure it out. But as I said, most of them are 4 gears for the quarter mile. I think it might be pretty good anyway. The key gear you want to look at is your final gear, which is probably 4th gear, as I said. See if you reach your top speed by the end of the drag strip. Didn't there. This engine's actually may use 5 gears, but I'm going to stick with 4 for now. In fact, you know what? I'm going to go with 5 because that did look like it was bogging down a bit. So we'll just try again going into 5th gear. I believe the power band in this car is around 9,000 onwards. As you can see, 5th gear wasn't quite at the top before crossing the line there. So what you do in this instance is go over to your gearing and increase 5th gear, decrease 5th gear, shorten it, move it to the right, so that when you cross the line it is maxed out, because you want to be optimizing the gears, keeping them in the power band. There we go, looks pretty good. Yeah, perfect. As you saw there, as we crossed the line, 5th gear was all the way maxed out in the red line as you want it. One thing I did see from there was 4th gear could be shortened a bit. So now you've figured out your 1st gear, your 2nd gear and your 5th gear. You just want to fine tune the gears in between to optimize being in the power band. This is where the graph comes in handy. You always want a smooth curve from the bottom of each gear line. So as you can see at the bottom of the screen there, each gear has a line on the graph. Picture the bottom of each line. Imagine that's just a point on the graph. You want a smooth curve going up from 1st gear all the way to 5th gear with the bottom, and you always want the higher gears to be a shorter line than the gear before. I am trying to really dumb this down, I'm sure, because I'm sure most of you know this already, but this is for those who don't have a clue. So as you can see there, you can increase 4th gear a bit because it is a bit too long compared to 5th, and we'll bump 3rd up a tiny bit as well. So we'll stick with that for the gearing, and then I just like to put the gear I'm not using all the way down to the left, just so it's, I don't know, I just like to do that. So that's the gearing done. We'll just give it a try now and see if it's alright. Into 3rd, about 8,500, about 9,200, 9,500 RPM going into 5th gear. So that looks pretty good. You probably could improve that a lot more, but it's good enough for now. So that's kind of the way you want to go about tuning the gearing. Now that is the main part about this launching method, because not much else really needs adjusting. The only areas you want to look at now are springs, damping, and your power front and rear for the differential. So what we're going to look at first is going to look at the damping. Now one thing I did notice there, and some of you may have noticed it as well, is that the rear of the car started to scrape along the ground when we hit the high speeds. So we'll see now. See that it is scraping on the ground now, and that is going to take speed off your time. Now a way to counteract that I've found is to increase your rear rebound and rear bump stiffness. So up it to about 3. This doesn't affect the launch too much, so you can get away with doing it. You want to have it as soft as possible, but without scraping the ground. So it looks like we've gone a bit too far there. The car didn't scrape the ground, but it was nowhere near scraping the ground, so I think we've stiffened it a bit too much. So I'll just cut to me messing around with this to try and get it into the optimum point. Right, so I've got it to a point where it is as soft as possible without scraping the ground, so we're going to leave that for now. Differential setting, it's pretty difficult to just naturally figure out what front and rear power bias you want. I don't know if that's the right way of saying it. But 80 looks alright. What we can do is try moving like 5% either way and seeing how it affects the launch of the car. You want it so it's spinning the least. Spinning the least but retains top end speed. That looked pretty good. The problem is if you set it to low percentage, like a 60% or so forth, you sacrifice top end speed. So it is better to move it to the right if you want top end speed, but you will sacrifice your launch going for more rear bias. So it's about finding the sweet spot. Not really going to go through doing that now because it is a bit trial and error, like a lot of other things about tuning. So just trial and error your differential front and rear percentage until you get to a point where you've got the best top end speed but you're still launching as quick as possible. I'm just going to leave it 85 because it looked like it was working pretty well there. Now I'm just going to go over a couple of things you can change but you don't really need to, because this tune just looked like it's working pretty well. As I said, the base setup tends to work really well for this launching method. Now a couple of things you can change. Springs, you can in some instances stiffen up the front. This is in case if you've got a car that's really high up with rally springs equipped, sometimes the front can lift into the air and be out of control. If you stiffen the front suspension, it stops the front lifting so much. Rear, you can add a bit of rear stiffness if the car's still scraping on the ground and you've got the damping quite high, or you want weight to transfer to the back more quickly. This does help in some instances, but most of my tunes with this, I don't really need to do that. This suspension setting with the springs and the ride height is the same suspension setting I have for my Leaderboard 6.840 McLaren F1, so that suspension setting tends to work pretty well. Damping, this is where things can differ. You pretty much always want your front bump stiffness at max. It just helps with launching, but then your front rebound stiffness, I either put it all the way up or all the way down. Now I can try it all the way down for this car, but I find for mid-engined supercars it tends to work better, it's all the way stiff. As you can see, lowering it really transfers more weight to the back of the car. It really leans back a lot more. It looks like it's actually worked quite well there, except the time doesn't really reflect that. I think the best time I got when I was running the setup I just finished was maybe an 8.05. See, I think now what it's doing, because if you lower it all the way, you can end up improving the launch, but another thing you can end up doing is when you reach the top end speed, the front wheels end up lifting off the ground, so you end up losing some of your power, because they're still sending power to the front wheels, but they're not in contact with the ground. In this instance, it worked best all the way stiff. Pretty much you want that all the way stiff or all the way soft. Just try both and see if you can get to the point where it works best. Rebound, you can try stiffening that anyway if you're forgetting about it scraping on the ground. You can try stiffening that for the same reason you stiffen the rear springs, to try and transfer weight to the back quicker, but when you do that the car tends to spin easier on the launch, so it's usually better to have it all the way soft with this launching method. Haven't really touched on anti-roll bars because you're only going in a straight line, so they're not really relevant. Tyres, you want to keep them all the way soft in most instances because that gives you the largest contact patch on the ground. Sometimes you want to stiffen the front, not stiffen, increase the front tyre pressure. Not really sure why. That's really in some instances where you have too much grip, so you don't actually need that much rolling resistance, so you can stiffen it a bit. I keep saying stiffen, increase the pressure a bit. And alignment, you don't really want to touch that unless you've got a car that's really high up. Then you want to add a bit of positive camber to the rear, for instance, because when you launch with a car with really high rear suspension, as the car squats, it naturally negatively cambers. So if you put a bit of positive camber on it, will counteract that. So the tyre will still be straight up once you're at full speed and the car's fully squatted. But in this instance, the ride height is very the travel in the suspension is quite small, so you don't need to do that. Keep all that the same. And well, that's the base setup, as I said, works really well, so you don't actually need to do that much fine tuning. I hope I've covered most of the small adjustments you can make to improve the times. If you have any other questions, make sure you tell me in the comments, because it is pretty difficult to cover everything in a video without the video being a million hours long. So I've definitely missed some stuff. Feel free to just ask questions in the comments section. And if you found this video helpful, make sure you leave a like, and that's it from me, and I'll see you next time.